We also have new developments today on a story News Nation's been all over since day one. We're learning the EPA did not qualify last year's train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, as a public health emergency. Derailment forced at least half the town to evacuate, still generating fears of long-term health consequences. And here we are more than a year later. News Nation investigative correspondent Rich McHugh, still on this story, joins us now. We know, Rich, about the concerns you've reported on, right? Toxic chemicals in the air, the water, the soil. But do we know why the EPA didn't officially call this a public health emergency?
Well, we're learning more, that's for sure. So what this shows, these are documents that are obtained through a FOIA by the Government Accountability Project. And what they show is that the EPA was discussing in a chain of emails health and whether to declare a public health emergency. And they decided not to after just 3 weeks. The email in question is from Robert Kaplan, an EPA attorney, in the email of EPA PR, when asked whether a document telling Norfolk Southern to clean up the contamination should include anything about medical benefits. He writes, "The issue of declaring a public health emergency is a difficult one. We have the authority, but have only used it once in Libby, Montana. Best not to get into this." But here's the thing. The EPA made this decision not to declare a public health emergency on February 20th, less than 3 weeks after the burning of those tank cars and after they had already found dioxins at the site of the burn. I asked Leslie Pacey with the Government Accountability Project why they would have been reticent to declare a public health emergency. Take a look.
If they admit it's a public health crisis, they have to admit that they participated in this public health crisis, which was allowing an open burn of chemicals, which should never have happened, and it was against their own statutes. And if they admit this, then they have to admit that there's some culpability from the EPA there.
Now, initial EPA and Norfolk Southern testing done at the derailment site shows the presence of dioxin, the most carcinogenic compounds on the planet. Residents were diagnosed with vinyl chloride in their blood, respiratory issues, yet no government agency, not the EPA or the CDC, have tested residents' health. One independent group has, Erin Haynes from the University of Kentucky. She tested 400 residents who live within a mile of the burn. Here's what she found. Take a look.
3 out of 4 of the participants reported having at least one new health symptom. And that within a mile of the derailment, 80% of the respondents reported an upper respiratory health symptom.
Now, 80%, Colonel, there's obviously a discrepancy between what she's finding and what the EPA is saying.
Right. Well, speaking of what the EPA is saying, I know throughout the day you've been trying to get the EPA side of this story. Do we have that now? Have we heard back?
We do. I sent a list of specific questions. They did not respond to those, but we have an answer I want to read. Environmental data collection continues with over 115 million air data points collected so far, and ongoing science-based reviews that show residents of East Palestine are not in danger from impacts to soil or air from the derailment. To date, evaluation of sampling data demonstrates that drinking water has not been impacted by this incident. So they're sticking to what they've been saying all along, Connell.
But your point is that they didn't answer the specific questions. In other words, they didn't address them at all in that statement. Is that?
Not yet. Not the ones that I sent to Mark Durno, who is in charge of the region. No.
All right, Rich. Thank you. Rich McHugh on top of this story. Scott Smith joins us now. Scott's an independent scientist. He's the Government Accountability Project's whistleblower client. You were listening to Rich's reporting, and I'm sure you're familiar with his reporting throughout all of this. Your reaction to what you just heard, including the EPA's response?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Connell, but the EPA is clearly operating as the public relations arm for the multi-billion-dollar corporation Norfolk Southern. So first of all, they have declared public health emergencies in Times Beach, Missouri, and also in Love Canal. So that's not accurate what they say. And you got to learn with the EPA to look very carefully at their statements. They're talking about the drinking water. There may not be a problem with the drinking water. And also the 100 million tests, the EPA wants you to think that they're doing the tests. But to the best of my knowledge, the majority of these tests are done by Norfolk Southern contractors. And in my work with Leslie Pacey and the Government Accountability Project, we've got FOIA. This is not us making it up. These are actual details that I sent to your team today, where there's one email where the Norfolk Southern tells the EPA, deal with us, don't deal with our contractors. So who's really in charge here? It's just not credible what the EPA is saying.
Okay, let's back up for a moment and just get everybody up to speed on exactly what we're talking about. First, the timeline. Let's put the timeline up on this disaster that much of our audience is very, very familiar with the derailment on the 3rd of February last year, the evacuations after that on the 5th, mandatory evacuations expanding on the 6th, and the order for evacuations lifted on the 8th. And if we have the list of toxic chemicals that's further down the line of our list of screens that we have there, we can put that up as well, because this, Scott, might be what you can be able to speak to. See, there it is, vinyl chloride linked to brain, lung, and blood cancers, and all these other chemicals down the list, toxic by ingestion, and another that causes burning, irritation to the skin and eyes, and the last one that causes dizziness and drowsiness. And, your point is that this should be more than enough to declare this a public health emergency, but also that there was precedent for that, they've done it before.
Absolutely. Let me put this in context.
Sure.
I've been doing it for 18 years and over 60 disasters, starting with my own. What makes East Palestine different is every chemical I've ever come across in 60 disasters is present in East Palestine. Why? It's the chemicals on the train. And why? The dioxins mixed with the chemicals you just cited and the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, cancer-causing, just like the dioxins. And there has never been a mixture of chemicals released like this. That's what makes East Palestine different and why East Palestine should be declared a public health emergency. In the EPA, they can talk about 100 million, they can talk about 1 billion tests, they can take all the upwind samples and they can manipulate all they want, but they have refused to test side by side with me. And I sent you an email from July 27th.
Right.
I have been willing to sit down with them and test side by side. They refuse. And on Taggart Street, I can tell you, I have a trend where the fingerprint from where the derailment was matches with what we are seeing, and you have the burning from February 3rd to 9th creating those dioxins. Then
Right.
you have the controlled explosion. Then you have the third event. And no one's talking about this. The third event is the ongoing heavy remediation after April 18th, which we are showing an increase in contamination and sulfur run in the sediment and in residents reporting health symptoms. And I continue to offer to sit down with the EPA, but they will not sit down with me.
They won't sit down with you. What about right now, Scott? What would you say about right now, as to best of your knowledge, with the most recent testing and data that you have, East Palestine and the situation, April 2024? What's it like?
Well, I would tell you that the good news, in a way, is, and all the smears and defamation coming at me from the EPA and Norfolk Southern, 60% of my results do say things are within background. 40% is in hot zones. So the hot zones need immediate follow-up testing, and that's by the EPA's own contractors. And they're refusing to test in what I call a hot zone, where you have elevated levels per your own standards set by the EPA. And they refuse to test these hot zones in these affected areas where residents are reporting health symptoms.
Still, present day, right now.
Still.
Yeah.
They still refuse.
Scott, we thank you for your time, Scott Smith, and we'll stay, as we have been, on top of this story.